December was supposed to feel like closure. Like relief. Like light at the end of a long year. But for her, it felt like everything was unraveling at once. Plans collapsed. Expectations dissolved. The calendar moved forward, but her sense of stability didn't follow. She watched the days pass with a growing tightness in her chest. What should have felt celebratory felt heavy instead. The contrast was painful. Everywhere she looked, there were reminders of endings, gratitude lists, promises of renewal. And yet, inside her, nothing felt resolved. She tried to hold herself together through routines. Through responsibilities. Through quiet resilience. But December has a way of exposing what we've been avoiding all year. And what surfaced for her was exhaustion, not the kind that sleep fixes, but the kind that comes from carrying too much for too long. Have you ever reached the end of a year feeling more fragmented than hopeful? She questioned herself constantly. Why now? Why at the very moment when things were supposed to feel lighter? She had made it through so much already. And yet, here she was, feeling like the ground beneath her was shifting instead of settling. There were nights when she stared at the ceiling, counting days instead of dreams. Wondering how she would cross into a new year without clarity, without answers, without the sense of completion she believed she needed. December felt less like an ending and more like exposure. She noticed how quiet her hope had become. It wasn't gone. It was tired. Worn down by postponement and uncertainty. She didn't feel dramatic despair. She felt something subtler, disorientation. A feeling of being out of alignment with the life she thought she was building. Does this feeling sound familiar to you too? She moved through her days aware that something was falling apart, but unable to name exactly what it was. Not one single thing. But many small fractures adding up. And the closer the month moved toward its end, the clearer it became that she couldn't carry December the same way she carried the rest of the year. She didn't know it yet, but this unraveling wasn't happening to her. It was preparing her. Because sometimes, what looks like collapse is actually realignment waiting to happen. As December continued to unravel, the weight of it pressed deeper into her days. It wasn't just one problem demanding attention. It was everything arriving at once, layered and relentless, leaving her no space to breathe. She felt behind in ways she couldn't explain, as if life had moved ahead without waiting for her to catch up. Loneliness settled in quietly. Even when surrounded by people, she felt unseen in her struggle. Conversations stayed on the surface while her inner world felt like it was quietly collapsing. She didn't want to dampen the season with her truth, so she carried it alone, smiling when expected, nodding when required. Have you ever felt this kind of isolation, where your pain feels out of place in a season that demands joy? Fear crept in during the quiet moments. Fear that she had missed something important. Fear that she had made the wrong choices. Fear that the year was ending without resolution, leaving her to carry unfinished stories into the next chapter. The uncertainty felt heavier than failure ever had. She questioned her own resilience. Not because she was weak, but because she was tired of being strong. Strength had become automatic, almost obligatory, and December was exposing how much she longed for relief. For alignment. For something to finally make sense. If this part of the story touches something inside you, pause for a moment and comment the word align below. Not as a promise, but as a reflection of what your heart might be seeking right now. She realized that asking for help didn't always look like a cry. Sometimes it looked like admitting she couldn't carry everything alone anymore. That realization softened her, even as the month continued to challenge her. And if stories like this resonate with you, consider subscribing. Not because everything suddenly falls into place, but because reminders of alignment and inner clarity matter, especially in moments like these. You might also think of someone who is struggling quietly through this season. Someone smiling on the outside while holding everything together on the inside. Sharing this story could be the gentle reminder they didn't know they needed. December still felt unstable. The answers hadn't arrived. But something important had already shifted. She had acknowledged the misalignment instead of ignoring it. And that awareness was preparing her for a decision that would change how the rest of the month, and her life, unfolded. The more December moved forward, the clearer it became that what was falling apart wasn't just her plans. It was her sense of direction. She had followed the right steps, made the responsible choices, stayed patient longer than she thought possible. And yet, here she was, staring at the end of the year with more questions than answers. She replayed moments from the past months, searching for where things had started to slip. Decisions that seemed harmless at the time. Delays she accepted without resistance. Hopes she quietly postponed, telling herself there would be a better moment later. Now, all of it felt heavier, as if December was asking her to account for everything she had set aside. Have you ever reached a point where you realize you've been surviving instead of truly living? She felt invisible in her effort. So much of what she carried went unnoticed. The emotional labor. The constant adjusting. The silent resilience. She wondered how many times she had minimized her own needs just to keep things stable, just to avoid disruption. Stability, she realized, had come at a cost. There were days when motivation vanished completely. Not because she didn't care, but because caring had started to feel painful. Each unfulfilled expectation left a quiet mark. Each delay reinforced the same internal question: what if this is all there is? Does this question feel familiar to you too? She noticed how December magnified everything. The lights, the music, the conversations about gratitude and new beginnings. All of it contrasted sharply with how she felt inside. It made her doubt herself even more. Why couldn't she feel hopeful like everyone else seemed to? She questioned whether her desires were unreasonable. Whether wanting clarity, peace, and alignment meant she was asking for too much. Over time, she had learned to settle quietly, convincing herself that endurance was the same as growth. Have you ever carried this kind of weight, where you keep going not because you feel aligned, but because stopping feels impossible? Despite everything, something inside her refused to shut down completely. A quiet awareness lingered beneath the discouragement. Not optimism, not certainty, just the sense that what was happening had meaning, even if she couldn't see it yet. She didn't know it then, but this deep discomfort was not a punishment. It was information. December wasn't breaking her. It was revealing exactly where she had drifted out of alignment. As December unfolded, she began to sense that the discomfort she felt wasn't random. It had a direction. A message embedded in the unease. The more she tried to distract herself, the louder the feeling became. Not aggressive. Persistent. As if something within her was asking to be acknowledged at last. She noticed how often she had silenced her own intuition throughout the year. Small inner nudges dismissed in the name of practicality. Feelings postponed because they didn't fit the timing. December, with all its endings and reflections, refused to let those moments stay buried any longer. Have you ever felt like life was gently, but firmly, asking you to look at something you've been avoiding? She felt torn between comfort and truth. Comfort meant keeping things as they were, even if they no longer fit. Truth meant admitting that some paths she stayed on out of habit had slowly drained her. That admission felt heavy, but also strangely relieving. There were moments when she caught herself longing for a pause from everything. Not to escape, but to realign. To remember what it felt like to move through life with clarity instead of obligation. December, she realized, was amplifying that longing rather than creating it. Does this tension between who you are and who you've been trying to be feel familiar? She reflected on how much energy she spent holding things together. Relationships. Expectations. Roles. All of it required constant adjustment. And while she had become skilled at maintaining balance, she had neglected to ask whether the balance itself was still aligned with her truth. A quiet sadness surfaced, not dramatic, but deep. The kind that comes from realizing you've been faithful to things that no longer nourish you. That realization hurt, but it also carried honesty. And honesty, she sensed, was the doorway to change. Have you ever felt this sadness, not because something ended, but because it lingered too long? She understood then that December wasn't asking her to push harder or endure longer. It was asking her to choose differently. To stop postponing alignment. To stop negotiating with discomfort. The month itself felt like a mirror, reflecting everything she could no longer ignore. She didn't yet know what the decision would be. But she knew one thing clearly. Something had to change. And December was no longer willing to wait. As December continued to press forward, she began to feel the quiet weight of everything she had postponed throughout the year. Not only decisions, but truths. Feelings she pushed aside because they felt inconvenient. Desires she minimized because they didn't fit the version of stability she had been trying to maintain. What once felt manageable now asked to be acknowledged. She saw clearly how often she had chosen familiarity over alignment. How she stayed where she was because it felt safer than stepping into the unknown. At the time, those choices felt responsible, even mature. But now, they felt heavy, like carrying commitments that no longer reflected who she was becoming. There was a gentle frustration that surfaced, not rooted in self-blame, but in honesty. She realized that clarity had been present for a long time, quietly waiting for her attention. The unease she felt was not confusion. It was information she had ignored because listening would require change. She reflected on the months behind her and noticed how often she had delayed her own needs. How easily she adapted to keep things running smoothly, even when that smoothness came at the expense of her inner peace. December was no longer allowing that pattern to remain invisible. A subtle sadness moved through her, not dramatic, but deep. The kind that comes from recognizing that something meaningful has been neglected, not lost. That sadness carried responsibility, but also possibility. It pointed towards something that still mattered enough to be reclaimed. She understood then that maintaining what no longer aligned required constant effort. It asked her to silence intuition, to override discomfort, to convince herself that endurance was the same as growth. Seeing this clearly changed how she related to her own resistance. December felt insistent, not cruel. Each day brought a reminder that alignment could no longer be postponed. The unraveling she experienced wasn't a failure of planning. It was a signal that the structure she relied on no longer supported who she was becoming. For the first time, she allowed herself to admit that nothing outside of her needed to collapse for change to be necessary. Sometimes, misalignment alone is reason enough. That realization loosened something inside her, creating space for honesty without panic. She didn't yet know what decision she would make. But she knew she could no longer continue unchanged. And that awareness, quiet and undeniable, marked the moment when December stopped feeling like an ending, and began to feel like a threshold. By the middle of December, she could no longer pretend that things would resolve on their own. The unraveling had reached a point where inaction felt heavier than any possible consequence of change. What unsettled her most wasn't fear of loss, it was the growing sense that staying the same would cost her something essential. She noticed how quiet her inner world had become. Not peaceful, but alert. As if every part of her was waiting. The constant noise of overthinking faded, replaced by a focused stillness that demanded honesty. She sensed that this was not a moment for analysis. It was a moment for choice. The decision didn't appear fully formed. It began as a subtle knowing. A realization that alignment would not come from fixing everything externally, but from choosing differently internally. One clear decision, she sensed, could recalibrate everything else. She reflected on how often she had waited for certainty before acting. How she had postponed movement until she felt ready, stable, assured. December had stripped that illusion away. Readiness, she understood now, was not a prerequisite for alignment. Willingness was. There was a strange calm in this realization. The pressure to solve everything dissolved. She no longer felt responsible for controlling outcomes. What mattered was the direction of her choice, not the details of how it would unfold. That understanding steadied her. She recognized that miracles were not always events that interrupted life dramatically. Sometimes they emerged when a person stopped betraying themselves. When they chose truth over comfort. Alignment over avoidance. That, she realized, was the miracle December was inviting her into. The decision she stood before was not loud or impulsive. It was quiet, intentional, and deeply personal. It asked her to honor what she had felt all along instead of negotiating with it. To trust that life could respond differently if she did. She felt the weight of responsibility, but not as burden. As authorship. This choice would not erase uncertainty. It would change her relationship with it. And that felt powerful in a way she hadn't experienced before. December no longer felt like it was falling apart. It felt like it was clearing space. And in that space, one decision waited. Ready to align her with something she had not yet imagined, but already sensed was real. The decision didn't arrive with drama or urgency. It arrived quietly, almost gently, as if it had been waiting for her attention all along. She didn't announce it to anyone. She didn't even fully explain it to herself. She simply felt the internal shift when she stopped resisting what she already knew. It wasn't about choosing a new path immediately or abandoning everything she had built. It was about choosing alignment over denial. About honoring what felt true instead of what felt expected. That choice alone altered the way she breathed, the way she stood, the way she moved through the rest of the day. She noticed how her body responded first. A subtle release in her shoulders. A loosening in her chest. It was as if something she had been carrying unconsciously had finally been set down. The relief surprised her. Not because her problems disappeared, but because the internal conflict had softened. She realized then how much energy she had been spending trying to hold misalignment together. Once she stopped, that energy returned to her. Not as excitement, but as clarity. The noise inside her quieted, making space for presence. This decision did not solve December. But it changed how December felt. The days no longer pressed against her with the same weight. Time seemed less aggressive. Moments felt more spacious. Even uncertainty lost some of its sharpness. She sensed that by choosing alignment, she had shifted her relationship with life itself. She was no longer bracing against what was happening. She was cooperating with it. That cooperation felt unfamiliar, but deeply right. There was no immediate confirmation from the outside world. No sign, no reassurance, no visible reward. And yet, she trusted the change she felt internally more than any external proof. That trust marked a turning point. She understood now that miracles do not always appear as sudden events. Sometimes they begin as decisions no one else sees. Decisions that realign the way we meet life, altering everything that follows quietly and steadily. December was still December. But she was no longer the same person moving through it. And that made all the difference. The shift showed itself quietly at first. Not as answers, but as ease. Situations that had felt tense softened without explanation. Conversations unfolded with less resistance. Things that once required effort began to move with a sense of cooperation she hadn't felt in a long time. She noticed it in small moments. A delay that turned out to be protection. An unexpected opening where she had stopped forcing an outcome. A calm response where anxiety used to live. These weren't dramatic changes, but they felt intentional, as if life were responding to her internal realignment. Her intuition felt clearer. Not louder, not urgent, just steady. She trusted it without needing to analyze why. For the first time in months, she wasn't second-guessing every step. She allowed herself to move forward without rehearsing failure in advance. December began to feel different. The days no longer pressed against her. They met her. What once felt like collapse now felt like redirection. She sensed that the unraveling she feared had been making room all along. Her perspective shifted naturally. Instead of asking what was going wrong, she began to notice what was no longer heavy. The absence of resistance became its own confirmation. She realized that alignment doesn't always add things to your life, sometimes it removes the struggle. She became more present. More responsive than reactive. The internal urgency that once defined her decisions softened, allowing clarity to rise without force. She trusted the pace of things instead of fighting it. Even her thoughts changed tone. Where she once anticipated loss, she now noticed possibility. Not optimism, possibility. That distinction mattered. Possibility felt grounded, realistic, available. She didn't rush to name these shifts as miracles. She didn't need to. What mattered was the coherence she felt returning to her life. A sense that things were no longer working against her, but with her. December hadn't suddenly become perfect. But it had become aligned. And alignment, she was learning, is where miracles quietly begin. As the days passed, the sense of alignment began to translate into movement. Not rushed, not overwhelming, but real. Things that had been stalled for weeks found their way forward. Messages were returned. Doors that felt closed reopened just enough to be reconsidered. It wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. She noticed how her emotional state stabilized. The constant fluctuation between hope and discouragement settled into something more grounded. She still felt uncertainty, but it no longer consumed her. Instead of spiraling, she paused. Instead of assuming the worst, she waited. That patience changed everything. Her energy shifted outward. People responded differently to her presence. Conversations felt more fluid, less defensive. She wasn't trying to convince or prove anything. She simply showed up aligned, and that alignment communicated itself without effort. She became aware of how often she had been pushing against timing before. Now, she listened. She allowed things to unfold without interference. This didn't slow her progress, it accelerated it in a way that felt natural and sustainable. December continued to move forward, but it no longer felt like a countdown to failure. It felt like a transition. Each day carried a subtle confirmation that choosing alignment had altered the trajectory of the month itself. She noticed opportunities she might have overlooked before. Not because they were new, but because she was now receptive. When the internal resistance softened, perception sharpened. She saw options where she once saw limitations. Her confidence grew quietly. Not as certainty about outcomes, but as trust in her responsiveness. She knew she could adjust, adapt, and remain present no matter what emerged. That knowing grounded her more deeply than any plan ever had. She reflected on how one decision had recalibrated everything else. It hadn't solved her life, but it had shifted her relationship with it. And that shift was creating momentum she hadn't felt in a long time. December no longer felt like it was slipping through her fingers. It felt like it was finally meeting her where she stood. And with each aligned step forward, the miracles she never chased began to recognize her. As momentum continued to build, she noticed a change that felt even more significant than external movement. Her inner world began to expand. Thoughts that once felt crowded and repetitive opened into clarity. She wasn't forcing optimism. She was experiencing coherence, a sense that her inner and outer worlds were finally speaking the same language. Her mornings felt different. Not lighter in a superficial way, but steadier. She woke with less tension in her body, less urgency in her mind. The day ahead no longer felt like something she had to survive. It felt like something she could participate in with presence and intention. She trusted herself more. Decisions didn't require endless justification. She listened to what felt aligned and acted from that place without over-explaining. This trust didn't come from certainty about results. It came from familiarity with her own inner signals. December revealed itself as a teacher now. Each situation reflected back what alignment felt like and what misalignment cost. She learned quickly, not through pain, but through contrast. The difference between forcing and allowing became unmistakable. Her emotional responses softened. Where frustration once lived, patience emerged. Where fear once dominated, curiosity appeared. She no longer needed to control every outcome to feel safe. She trusted the process she was now cooperating with. She noticed how often she paused before reacting. That pause became powerful. It allowed her to choose consciously instead of repeating old patterns. This awareness reshaped how she handled conversations, responsibilities, and unexpected changes. Her sense of self stabilized. She no longer felt fragmented by expectations or pulled in conflicting directions. Alignment gave her a center, a place she could return to regardless of circumstances. That center grounded her more deeply than external stability ever had. December no longer symbolized endings alone. It began to represent integration. A moment where lessons gathered, not to overwhelm her, but to clarify what mattered moving forward. She realized then that miracles were not interruptions of reality. They were expressions of alignment. And alignment, once chosen, continued to unfold quietly, reshaping not just December, but the foundation of the life she was now building. As the days unfolded, the alignment she felt internally began to show itself outwardly in ways she hadn't planned. Not as sudden breakthroughs, but as recognition. People responded to her with more openness. Situations that once felt tense now carried ease. The energy around her had shifted, and the world seemed to notice. She didn't announce this change. She didn't try to explain it. It simply showed. In her posture. In her voice. In the way she moved through conversations without shrinking or overextending. She was no longer trying to hold everything together. She was present, and presence was powerful. Opportunities appeared that matched this new state. Not overwhelming, not misaligned. They felt appropriate, timely, almost familiar. She recognized them not by excitement, but by calm. That calm became her compass. She noticed how much less effort things required now. Where she once pushed, she now allowed. Where she once questioned herself, she trusted. This didn't make life effortless, but it made it coherent. And coherence brought momentum. December reflected this change back to her. Situations resolved more smoothly. Decisions carried less emotional weight. Even challenges felt different, not as obstacles, but as refinements. Each experience reinforced the same truth: alignment creates its own support. She felt more authentic in her interactions. She spoke honestly without needing to justify herself. She listened without preparing defenses. This authenticity deepened her connections and simplified her choices. Her confidence no longer depended on external validation. Recognition felt welcome, but not necessary. She knew now that alignment didn't require applause. It required consistency. And she was living that consistency quietly, steadily. She reflected on how different this December felt from how it began. What once felt like collapse now felt like coordination. The month was no longer falling apart. It was reorganizing itself around her new center. She understood then that miracles often arrive disguised as natural consequences of alignment. When we stop fighting ourselves, life stops fighting us. The shift may be subtle, but its effects are undeniable. December was no longer testing her. It was responding to her. And as she moved forward, aligned and attentive, she sensed that this was only the beginning of what choosing herself had set in motion. As alignment continued to guide her, the changes around her became more tangible. Not exaggerated, not unreal, simply undeniable. What once felt blocked began to flow. Situations that had resisted resolution found their way forward with surprising ease. The timing felt precise, almost intentional. She noticed how help arrived without being requested. The right person appeared at the right moment. Information surfaced exactly when she needed it. These moments didn't feel random anymore. They felt responsive, as if life itself was meeting her willingness halfway. Her trust deepened. She no longer questioned whether alignment worked. She experienced it. The calm she felt internally now reflected outwardly in practical ways, decisions clarified, paths simplified, outcomes unfolded without struggle. December no longer felt heavy with unfinished business. It began to feel purposeful. Each day carried a quiet confirmation that choosing alignment had shifted the entire tone of the month. What once threatened to overwhelm her now felt manageable, even meaningful. She realized that miracles rarely look like instant transformation. They look like coherence returning. Like resistance dissolving. Like effort being replaced with cooperation. And this cooperation was changing the quality of her life. Her sense of abundance expanded beyond material outcomes. It showed up emotionally. In peace. In relief. In the absence of constant tension. She felt supported, not because everything went perfectly, but because nothing felt random anymore. She reflected on how much energy she had saved by choosing alignment. Energy that once went into worry now went into presence. Energy once spent on control now supported creativity and connection. This redistribution of energy felt like a miracle in itself. December had become a turning point. Not because something external rescued her, but because she chose differently. That choice recalibrated everything else. The month was no longer something to survive. It was something to complete with awareness. She understood now that miracles don't interrupt alignment. They emerge from it. And as December continued, she sensed that this unfolding was not temporary. It was foundational. A new way of moving through life had begun, quietly, steadily, and powerfully. By now, she could feel the difference not just in circumstances, but in how she related to time itself. December no longer felt like a deadline chasing her. It felt like a passage she was moving through with intention. The urgency that once clouded her choices had softened into trust. She noticed how her thoughts no longer raced ahead, trying to predict what might go wrong. Instead, they stayed closer to the present moment. This presence changed how she experienced everything. Even uncertainty felt less threatening when she wasn't living several steps ahead of herself. Her trust in life matured. It wasn't blind optimism or spiritual bypassing. It was grounded confidence in her ability to respond. She understood that alignment didn't mean avoiding difficulty. It meant meeting it without resistance or self-betrayal. December offered small tests, moments that once would have unsettled her. This time, she moved through them with steadiness. She didn't rush to fix or escape. She listened. She responded. And each response reinforced her trust in this new way of living. She felt more connected to herself than she had all year. Not because she had answers, but because she was honest about where she stood. That honesty brought relief. She no longer needed to pretend that everything was fine in order to keep moving forward. The miracles continued quietly. Not always visible to others, but deeply felt by her. A sense of rightness. A calm acceptance. A feeling that life was no longer working against her, but rearranging itself around her clarity. She reflected on how one decision had shifted her relationship with everything else. It hadn't erased responsibility or effort. It had changed the quality of her effort. What once felt forced now felt aligned. What once felt heavy now felt purposeful. December became a symbol of integration rather than collapse. A month that gathered lessons instead of scattering them. She could feel herself closing the year differently, not with exhaustion, but with awareness. She understood now that alignment is not a destination. It is a practice. And she was living it, quietly, consciously, and with a trust that no longer needed proof. As December moved toward its final days, she noticed something quietly profound. The month that once felt like a threat now felt complete. Not perfect. Complete. The chaos that once unsettled her had rearranged itself into understanding. The unraveling had revealed structure she couldn't see before. She felt a new relationship forming with endings. They no longer frightened her. Endings now felt like alignment points, moments where truth rises to the surface and asks to be honored. December had done exactly that. It had stripped away what no longer fit and returned her to herself. Her gratitude deepened, not because everything turned out the way she once hoped, but because everything made sense now. The delays, the discomfort, the pressure, all of it had guided her toward one decision that changed how she moved through life. That awareness softened her entire year in retrospect. She noticed how calm she felt when reflecting on what had fallen apart. There was no resentment left. No urgency to fix the past. She understood that collapse had been part of alignment. What couldn't continue had been released so that something truer could take shape. December no longer carried the weight of expectation. It carried clarity. She felt grounded as the year closed, not rushing toward what came next, but standing fully in where she was. That presence felt like a quiet victory. She reflected on how different this ending felt compared to others she had known. There was no dramatic resolution. No grand announcement. Just coherence. A sense that her life was no longer fragmented into competing demands, but gathered into a direction that felt honest. The miracles she once hoped for had not arrived as sudden events. They had arrived as steadiness. As flow. As the absence of internal conflict. And that, she realized, was the most sustainable miracle of all. December gave her back her center. And in doing so, it restored its own meaning. She didn't know exactly what the new year would bring. But for the first time, she didn't feel the need to know. She was aligned. And alignment had already changed everything. As the year prepared to close, she noticed how the alignment she had chosen no longer felt fragile. It wasn't something that depended on circumstances staying calm or plans unfolding perfectly. It had become part of how she met life itself. Steady. Present. Honest. She moved through her days with a different kind of attention. Not scanning for problems, not bracing for disappointment. She listened. She responded. She trusted that whatever arose could be met without abandoning herself. This trust felt earned, shaped by the unraveling she had survived and the decisions she had honored. December no longer echoed with urgency. It carried a sense of completion that didn't require everything to be resolved. She understood now that alignment doesn't mean closure in the traditional sense. It means coherence, knowing where you stand even when the path ahead is still forming. She felt more spacious inside her own life. Choices felt lighter because they were clearer. She didn't negotiate with discomfort anymore. She acknowledged it, learned from it, and moved accordingly. That alone simplified everything. Her relationship with uncertainty transformed. Instead of resisting it, she allowed it to inform her awareness. Uncertainty no longer meant danger. It meant possibility. This shift changed how she approached the unknown parts of the future. She recognized how much energy alignment returned to her. Energy once spent on worry now supported creativity. Energy once used to hold things together now allowed things to flow. This redistribution felt subtle, but it changed the quality of every day. She no longer needed December to be anything other than what it was. The month had done its work. It had brought truth to the surface and guided her toward herself. That was enough. As the year closed, she didn't rush to define the next one. She trusted that alignment would continue to reveal what mattered when the timing was right. That patience felt like strength, not delay. She carried this understanding forward quietly. Not as a promise, not as a resolution, but as a way of being. Alignment was no longer something she searched for. It was something she practiced. December had fallen apart. And in doing so, it had aligned her with miracles that didn't shout. They stayed. What surprised her most was how natural this new way of living began to feel. The alignment she once thought would require constant effort now moved effortlessly beneath her choices. It wasn't something she had to remember to do. It was something she had become aware of, moment by moment. She noticed how her reactions continued to soften. Situations that once triggered urgency no longer pulled her out of herself. She paused instinctively now, giving herself space to respond with intention rather than habit. That pause became one of the most powerful changes of all. The decision she made earlier in December revealed its depth over time. It wasn't a single moment of courage. It was a commitment she kept honoring quietly. Each aligned choice reinforced the next, creating a foundation that felt stable without being rigid. She felt more rooted in her values. Not because she defined them explicitly, but because her actions reflected them naturally. What she said yes to felt honest. What she declined no longer carried guilt. This clarity protected her energy in ways she hadn't known she needed. She realized that miracles didn't always arrive as additions. Often, they arrived as simplifications. Fewer inner conflicts. Fewer negotiations with discomfort. Fewer moments of self-betrayal. Life felt cleaner, more intentional. December had become a mirror she was no longer afraid to look into. It reflected growth instead of loss. Awareness instead of confusion. She could see now how the month had stripped away what was unsustainable so that something true could remain. She no longer measured progress by visible results alone. She felt progress internally, in calmness, in coherence, in the absence of constant inner tension. That internal shift mattered more than any external milestone. As she moved forward, she carried December with her differently. Not as a season that broke her, but as one that clarified her. A moment when life asked for alignment, and she answered. This quiet foundation would support everything that followed. And she sensed that what came next would rise naturally from it. She began to understand that alignment was not something she achieved once and kept forever. It was alive. Responsive. It required presence rather than perfection. Each day invited her to listen again, to notice where she felt open and where she felt resistance, and to choose with honesty. This awareness changed how she related to effort. She no longer pushed herself to prove anything. Action came from clarity, not pressure. Rest came from permission, not exhaustion. Life felt less like a series of demands and more like a dialogue she was finally participating in fully. She noticed how gently her intuition guided her now. Not through urgency, but through quiet signals she trusted without argument. When something felt aligned, it carried ease even when it required courage. When something felt misaligned, the tension appeared early, allowing her to respond before discomfort accumulated. December's lessons continued to unfold beyond the month itself. She saw how alignment influenced everything, her boundaries, her creativity, her relationships, her pace. Nothing needed to be dramatic to be meaningful. Consistency became the miracle. She no longer chased reassurance. She recognized it internally. That shift freed her from waiting for signs or confirmations. Life responded more clearly when she stopped demanding proof and started offering presence. Her sense of self stabilized further. She felt less fragmented, less divided between who she was and who she thought she needed to be. Integration replaced effort. Coherence replaced control. This felt like maturity, not limitation. She trusted the unfolding of things now. Not because she expected ease, but because she trusted her capacity to remain aligned even when challenges arose. That trust made the unknown feel navigable rather than threatening. December had given her a language for living, one rooted in attention, honesty, and choice. She carried that language forward, allowing it to shape her days without needing to define the future too tightly. Alignment was no longer an idea. It was how she lived. And as she moved forward, grounded and attentive, she sensed that the miracles ahead would not need to announce themselves. They would arrive naturally, in rhythm with who she had become. As December finally reached its end, she stood quietly inside a life that felt different, not because everything had changed, but because she had. The urgency that once defined her days no longer dictated her steps. In its place lived presence, discernment, and a calm trust she had never known before. She understood now that the month hadn't been cruel. It had been precise. Every moment of discomfort, every unraveling, every pause had guided her toward one essential truth: alignment is not something we wait for. It is something we choose. What once felt like collapse revealed itself as correction. What once felt like loss became clarity. December hadn't taken anything from her that was meant to remain. It had removed what prevented her from meeting life honestly. She no longer measured miracles by dramatic outcomes. She recognized them in the quiet coherence of her days. In the way her thoughts no longer fought her feelings. In the way her choices no longer betrayed her intuition. In the way life began to respond without resistance. She carried forward a new relationship with uncertainty. It no longer frightened her. It invited her to stay present. To listen. To choose again. Alignment had taught her that the future doesn't need to be controlled, it needs to be met with integrity. This was the miracle December offered her. Not rescue. Not perfection. But authorship. She had learned how to stand inside her life without negotiating her truth. How to move without forcing. How to trust without demanding guarantees. And that knowledge changed everything. As the year closed, she didn't rush to name what would come next. She trusted that alignment would continue to guide her, just as it had through the unraveling. That trust felt solid, lived in, and real. December had fallen apart. And in doing so, it aligned her with miracles that didn't need to shout. They stayed. They supported. They became the way she lived. And that, she knew, was everything.